Oh, hello, and welcome to the Sunday edition of Adam's Music Box. And as promised, after yesterday's sort of very solemn and sad and maybe scary stream because of the horrible things going on in a certain part of the world that we talked about yesterday, I did promise you that today we would keep it lighter and brighter. So, what better way to distract ourselves from the horror going on than by talking about comedy, the last of all of the great arts to die? Because even when music and drama and poetry disintegrates and becomes degenerate, we will always be able to mock something. And I'm sort of an optimist and a pessimist simultaneously, because I realize what goes around comes around. One epoch disintegrates and degenerates, and another will rise. Maybe we're in one of these intermediate periods, but comedy, as always, is strong when there is something to mock. But I'm not here to talk about today's comedy. I'm here to talk about the comedy of the 90s, when there was a huge satire boom. Just look at all of the shows that came out of the 90s. There was South Park came out. There was Family Guy that came out. King of the Hill came out. Um, all of the Sacha Baron Cohen stuff came out. And at the beginning of the 90s, in 1993 to be exact, the mother of them all came out. Beavis and Butthead. And it was a work of Mike Judge, who I consider to be an absolute genius, because he's able to be satirical and pithy and scathing without being overt. The wordplay, the subtlety of the socially and politically charged humor, without ever taking one side or the other, it's there, but it's below the surface. It's the laughter between the laughs, and that's something that Mike Judge has put into everything that he's done. I mean, King of the Hill is a masterpiece, but Beavis and Butthead is where it all began. Now, why am I talking about comedy shows on a music YouTube channel? Well, the reason is because music was a central part of the Beavis and Butthead character arc, a central part of the development of the scenery in which the show took place, a key aspect of the cultural milieu that Mike Judge was trying to, and I think was very successful in portraying on Beavis and Butthead. Now, think about it. What did Beavis and Butthead like the most in life? Well, they liked TV, they liked music, they liked nachos and other forms of fast food, and they liked the idea of scoring, even though that proved to be perpetually elusive, being the ongoing joke. Now, the lives of Beavis and Butthead themselves were something that at the time felt all too real, which is why I think a lot of people at the time, especially people on sort of the woke censorious side, we didn't call them woke at the time, and I know that that's not precisely what censorious means, but hey, you out there know what I mean. They criticized Beavis and Butthead for being too crass, for promoting stupidity, for promoting violence, all of the same crap that censors in any generation say. But Beavis and Butthead was really a mirror to the declining stability of lower middle class life in the United States. And now that middle class life, including sort of the middle of the middle and even the upper echelons of the middle, has declined so much because of inflation, broken families across almost all races, except for some Asian families and Hispanic. But when it comes to the white and black population, which when combined is the majority, the broken families are absolutely out of control. It began with the black population in the 60s, as the Kerner Report told the world, but no one cared to read it. And by the time you get to sort of late Gen X, early millennial, the era of Beavis and Butthead, we see this starting to creep into the the white lower middle class. The great tech boom of the 90s didn't really serve them well, something that the middle of the middle class would find out in the 2008 recession, and that everyone other than the incredibly wealthy found out when they started printing money like mad a few years back. So Beavis and Butthead held up a mirror to an America that the sort of middle class mainstream and elements of the corporate mainstream didn't want people to see. This was a place that on the surface looked like the stability of 50s and early 60s America. It was a suburban life where there were functional small businesses, the shopping malls were crowded, the schools were bad, but hey, they were open and they were employing people. But below this surface were people that came from broken homes, people whose own lack of parental tutelage exposed the schools for being wholly inadequate in their mission to educate, and for whom the only real entertainment came from basic cable or broadcast television, the TV and the MTV, as another Mike Judge character, Hank Hill, would later say. Now, this explains a lot about what frightened people about the very real society that Beavis and Butthead showed. Of course, all humor has exaggerations, but I think we can safely say in hindsight that there was a lot more accuracy in the sociological aspects of Beavis and Butthead than a lot of people at the time were willing to openly admit. Now, what does it mean for the world of music? Well, it means a lot because music was at the center of Beavis and Butthead's life. Of all of the things that they watched on TV, it was music on MTV that was the most prominent. They knew about the videos, they knew about the politics, the sociology, and the history of the artists, which goes to show that when people find learning entertaining, even the people who are apparently the most functionally idiotic, they'll be able to retain information. And if they were given the tools of how to, enter the music business, maybe they could have been, record producers. They're not all that stupid than the average record producer. Kidding, but you know what I mean. But music was at the center of their culture. Music was readily available. There were radios on the job sites that they walked around. There was music on the television that they watched perpetually. They aspired to be rock stars whenever, not that they had real aspirations, but whenever they'd close their eyes and dream, the joke was always that they were playing guitar, getting the chicks, rocking out, and that was such a central part of Beavis and Butthead's MO. Now, what has happened in the years since? Well, the fragility of the lower middle class suburbs totally exploded into ghettoization, while the middle class suburbs are now places with either broken families or small families or BlackRock owned vacant houses where crime is up and the filth is everywhere. I mean, physical filth, garbage, rubbish, trash, call it what you will. And we're getting to the stage today where, because of crime, because of an uncontrolled population explosion, mainly due to open borders, due to a total lack of cultural cohesion, due to a decline in educational standards, and to other things, we now see that what used to be the bottom of the barrel in 1993 is now, average everyday life, unless you're a hedge fund type of person or someone who works with Elon Musk or that type of thing. So in many ways, Beavis and Butthead was foretelling what would happen by showing the people just clinging on to the lowest rung of the suburbs and that suburban ideal, and what can happen when you're just sort of drifting like dust in the wind. A reference to a song that Beavis and Butthead would have known. It showed that, hey, this is what we're all in store for. And maybe the reason that the cultural and economic gatekeepers of the 90s, who in various other ways knew that this was coming, maybe the reason they didn't want people watching Beavis and Butthead is they didn't want them to see what was in store. They wanted you to be surprised. And so, in this sense, Beavis and Butthead was very much an important show during its era because it held a mirror up to the things in lower middle class suburbia that the owners of the world did not want the American and global public to see. In hindsight, Beavis and Butthead is important because it shows the world where we were headed and how you can always look at the bottom of the barrel to see what rises up. Now, in terms of music, there's another interesting angle because around, I think, 2011, they briefly brought Beavis and Butthead back. And lo and behold, while the personalities of the characters were the same, the music that was such an important and integral part of the original, the classic run of the series, and the film that went along with it, Beavis and Butthead Do America, all of a sudden, music was of much less importance. So, what happened between 1993 and and 2011 to make music less important? Well, several things happened. The first is that the music industry itself imploded, and they imploded because of a combination of greed and lack of foresight, which is one of the reasons why the idyllic America that Beavis and Butthead was exposing as having chinks in the armor, it fell for some of the same reasons, greed and lack of foresight. Now, Beavis and Butthead's original run ended in 1997. It was just a few short years later that Napster exploded. Now, Napster was the first time that you could get music of your own for free other than listening to commercial radio. Napster was revolutionary at the time because it used peer to peer software in a very easy to use user interface, which allowed people from around the world to download almost any piece of music ever. I mean, looking back at it, there were some things available on Napster that have still not made it to Spotify and the others. And this sent a shockwave deep into the heart of the music industry because they didn't know how to react. Their entire business model of selling physical media was gone because something more convenient and free had replaced it. Now, admittedly, people who were probably older than 23, 24, 25, they probably weren't using Napster that much. It was for the kids. But from the 50s until the 90s, some of the biggest buyers of music were kids. It's what they spent their allowance on when they were youngsters. It's what they spent a lot of the money from work on when they were when they were in their teens. It was a huge part of social life, owning a record or a tape or a CD. It was just a central part of the experience of young people, and that was something frankly unique to the 20th century, because before the 20th century the only way to bring music into your home was to either buy an instrument and learn it, befriend someone who had, or in the very late 19th century get a self-playing instrument, most famously a player piano. And while many people had them, it wasn't the kind of thing that was within the reach of an adolescent at that time, where by the 50s, a 45 record and even LPs were things within the reach of adolescents. And music became a central part of the youthful experience, arguably as much as television, maybe even more so, because, well, there were only two or three channels, and there was only good programming on between sort of 5 in the afternoon and maybe 11 at night, midnight, not much beyond that. With music, there was a lot more variety, and you could bring it to your room, you could bring it to a friend's house. It was really a wonderful vehicle of both personal and artistic expression, so much so that I would say that the listening experience at the time was really part and parcel of the overall artistic experience. Now, Beavis and Butthead's generation, again, the older Gen X, the younger millennials, it was that lost generation when music was this central to one's existence. And Napster, in many ways, was the final hurrah because it made the music more accessible than ever to young people, and it made more of it, more variety accessible to young people than ever before. The music industry should have said, "This is great. We'll find a way to make money off of it, because when there is a will, there is always a way to make money off of any popular product." But again, because of lack of foresight and because of greed, they sued Napster out of existence rather than buying it or striking a deal with it or just watching it grow and then doing a deal with it. Very, very stupid. And it was something that the music industry came to regret, because within the next decade, there was no music industry per se. There was a tech industry, and the remains of the music industry was like a barnacle onto the hull of big tech. Now, once they sued Napster out of existence, you got some Napster clones that popped up. There was Kazaa, there was LimeWire, there were others. And what that proved is that you can sue them all, but one will germinate just as quickly as the other one is shut down by a court order. And so Steve Jobs approached the music industry and said, "Look, you're going to have to eat some humble pie." Good band, by the way. And what you're going to have to do is allow Apple to sell your music legally, but every song for $1. and you're not allowed to bundle it in albums. You can sell them as albums for, well, the a discounted price, but every song individually is a buck. And the music industry was shocked because by the 90s, they had gotten really used to just screwing the customer base over royally. The average price of a compact disc in the 90s was between $15 and $20. Now, everything in the world, just about since the 90s, has gone up in price. Property, cars, food, clothing, drugs, all kinds. All of it has gone up. Whereas the price of a compact disc, which is produced, which is manufactured in the same way now as it was then, is now much cheaper, even though there's fewer of them. And, mass production generally makes things cheaper. So when you add all of those components together, you can really see how much of a profit margin the record labels, the music industry was squeezing out of Joe Public, out of the customer. And so that was part of their undoing. And Steve Jobs said, look, there's a new sheriff in town. Either you get some sales, some residuals, some revenue by going with me, or you can just let the new clones of Napster pop up indefinitely. And sure enough, Steve Jobs was right, because iTunes was very convenient. It was safe from viruses and other such things. It was affordable. And most people, when there's a legal, affordable way to buy something, they will choose that over something that's pirated but less convenient. So Steve Jobs and the tech industry as a whole became the sort of leaders of the new music industry. And from that day forward, the music industry as we knew it continued to shrink and shrink and shrink. And so now we get to the year 2011. Music suddenly isn't a central part of youth culture. And the distance in time between 1993 and 2011 wasn't all that big. But music in that time had become so comparatively peripheral to youth culture that the reimagined, and frankly not as good, but still good, Beavis and Butthead of the new millennium, they weren't sitting around watching music videos. They weren't dreaming about being rock stars. So, what are other reasons besides the profligate agenda of the music and behavior of the music industry that caused this to decline? Well, I put out a video not long ago where I talked about how rock music in particular, which was the genre du jour of Beavis and Butthead, how rock music tended to have a lifespan similar to that of the classic North American suburb. They both rose to prominence in the 1950s with origins in the 1940s. And as the suburbs became more prosperous, rock and roll music became the de facto genre that defined the pop music of the late 60s, 70s, 80s into the 90s. And then in the 2000s, this began to shift, and hip hop derived musical languages, if you will, began to dominate the pop world. Now, surprise, surprise, this parallels the rise and fall of the suburb. As the suburbs became more and more of an implicit part of the North American family experience, so too did rock and roll, and all of the merchandising and music videos and concert going that went along with it became a central part of young people and young male in particular experience. When the suburbs go away, you see that the adolescent male, the white adolescent male in particular, is less of a defining feature of the culture and more of something that's either pushed consciously to the periphery or unconsciously to the periphery. And the music that they created and that they enjoyed and that they consumed also gets pushed further to the periphery. So while Beavis and Butthead aren't the archetypes of the prosperous suburban young white males, they are the archetypes of the non-prosperous and neglected bottom rung of the lower middle class white suburban male. And one thing that Beavis and Butthead would have had in common with someone from a nicer suburb with a real family, more education, more prosperity, is that they would have been listening to similar music. This reality was even acknowledged in the series itself, because the geeky, nerdy kid from a well-to-do family with their comical problems and pomposities that Mike Judge made fun of, but the kid Stuart. Stewart had his shirt that said Winger, whereas Beavis had Metallica and Butthead had AC/DC. And the joke was that, Winger is a bit more melodic, a bit more geeky. But the fact of the matter is, what this showed is that people at all rungs of suburbia were attracted to this kind of music. It was such a central part of their lives that not only did they know the bands on the music videos, but they wore it on their shirts. You didn't really see that much in the following 10 years. It started to decline. People were advertising other lifestyle consumption choices on their shirts. Gaming tended to replace music as the top consumption choice of entertainment for young people. And even the television viewing experience itself, it got replaced by social media. Now, the change in the media scene, again, it was no reason that the kinds of music that Beavis and Butthead loved, it was not the central reason why this faded into the periphery. But I would say that it was certainly something that happened simultaneously, but foremostly, it was this cultural shift. What Beavis and Butthead shows is it was the lost stand of suburbia, the lost stand of rock and roll, the lost stand of the music industry as it had been known since the 1950s up to the birth of Napster. And so, in this sense, I said earlier in the video why Beavis and Butthead was so relevant at the time. The reason that it is now increasingly relevant in hindsight is it offers a sociologically and, dare I say, anthropologically accurate look at all of the things that would be gone in the new millennium. Music as the central focal point of cultural and consumer life for young people, the suburban lifestyle itself, the idea that the young white male has a role to play in shaping the culture, all of these things ended in the new millennium. And Beavis and Butthead is a focal point of the lost stand of suburbia, if the glass is half full, or the beginning of the unraveling of it, if the glass is half empty, depending on your point of view. And again, Mike Judge is a genius for portraying this all in a way that makes us not so much think consciously, but laugh our asses off and unconsciously absorb all of this. One of the true comic talents, I think, of all time. But that's what I think. Let me know what you think. As always, like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.